The first light of dawn slipped through the narrow curtains of a small home in Soweto, painting the walls in pale gold. Lindiwe stood by the window, her delicate frame outlined against the morning glow. Her face, beautiful but weary, carried the quiet marks of long nights filled with worry. She clasped her arms across her chest, not for warmth but for strength, as her eyes traced the empty streets. The world outside was waking with hope, yet inside her heart was a silence too heavy to bear. She longed for peace, but peace had become a stranger in her home. The creak of the door shattered her fragile calm. Thabo staggered in, his shirt wrinkled, his steps unsteady. The stench of alcohol filled the room, mixed with the faint but unmistakable perfume of another woman. He laughed to himself, careless and cruel, as if life were nothing but a game. His shoes scraped across the floor, each sound echoing like a reminder of betrayal. Lindiwe did not move, her body still as stone, her eyes locked on him. She said nothing, but her silence carried a storm fiercer than any words could. He dropped onto the couch with a thud, chuckling at some private joke, oblivious to the pain he dragged in with him. His laughter was jagged, hollow, and it clashed with the fragile morning like thunder tearing through dawn. Lindiwe's lips trembled, but she held them closed, swallowing the scream that pressed against her chest. Her hands gripped the windowsill as though it alone could anchor her in the rising tide of sorrow. Behind her calm ease, memories replayed, of vows once spoken, of love once pure, of nights when he held her close and whispered promises of forever. Now all that remained were shadows of broken vows, carried on the scent of cheap liquor and another woman's embrace. She breathed deeply, steadying her heart, not to break in front of him. The sun rose higher, but the darkness inside her remained. And in that moment, though she said nothing, her silence spoke louder than his laughter, an unspoken declaration that the storm within her was only just beginning. In the dim hallway, little Ayanda stood barefoot, clutching the corner of the wall as if it could hide her from the truth spilling across her home. She was too young to understand the weight of broken promises, yet old enough to feel their sting. Her big brown eyes, wide with confusion, darted between her mother's quiet tears and her father's stumbling form. The house, once filled with laughter and bedtime stories, now carried an air so heavy it pressed down on her small chest. She watched her mother's shoulders shake, though no sound escaped Lindiwe's lips. Silent tears slid down her face, falling onto her hands folded tightly in her lap. To Ayanda, those tears were louder than any cry. She wanted to run to her mother, to wipe them away with her little hands, but her feet would not move. Something about the stillness in the room warned her that this was not the moment to break the silence. Her father's drunken laughter echoed through the house, a cruel melody that clashed with the fragile morning. He tossed his shoes aside carelessly, the thud making Ayanda flinch. She had once adored him, chasing after him when he came home from work, clinging to his legs until he lifted her high into the air. Now, that man felt like a stranger. She could smell the strange perfume too, and though she didn't know its meaning, she knew it did not. The evening meal sat steaming on the wooden table, the smell of stew filling the air. Lindiwe placed the bowl gently in front of Thabo, her hands steady though her heart trembled. She had cooked with care, hoping that maybe food could soften the tension that had become their daily companion. For a brief moment, she stood silently, waiting for a word of gratitude, a flicker of the man she once loved. But instead, Thabo leaned back in his chair, smirking, his eyes glazed with drink. He poked at the food with his spoon and chuckled. "Is this all you could manage? No wonder I stay out late," he sneered, his voice thick with contempt. The words pierced Lindiwe deeper than any blade could. She felt Ayanda's quiet presence in the corner, watching, listening, learning. The humiliation burned her cheeks, but this time, she did not swallow her pain. Her breath shook as she finally spoke, her voice fragile yet unyielding. "This is not the man I married." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, slicing through the room like a blade of truth. Thabo froze for a moment, his pride stung, before his hand slammed against the table with a violent crack. The bowl rattled, stew spilling onto the cloth, the sound echoing like thunder inside the small home. "Don't lecture me," he roared, his voice filling the space with anger. His eyes blazed, daring her to say more, daring her to defy him. Yet Lindiwe stood her ground. Though her knees shook beneath her dress, her spirit refused to bend. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the quickened breath of a woman who had finally dared to speak her truth. In that heavy stillness, the walls themselves seemed to lean closer, holding the weight of what had just been spoken. Ayanda's innocent eyes widened, the image of her father's rage etched deep into her memory. And though Thabo turned away, refusing to hear, the words had already been spoken, and they could never be taken back. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that wrapped around the house like a shroud. Outside, Soweto slept, but inside, Lindiwe's heart wrestled with storms no one else could see. She knelt beside her bed, the wooden floor cool beneath her knees, her hands clasped tightly as if she could hold herself together through prayer. Her whispers filled the room, soft but urgent, pleading not for escape but for strength. Lord, give me courage, give me peace, show me the path. She breathed, tears slipping down her face and staining the fabric of her nightdress. When her prayer slowed, she rose to her feet and drifted toward the small mirror, nailed crookedly on the wall. The glass was cracked through the middle, dividing her reflection into fractured pieces, as if the mirror itself carried her story. She stared into it, seeing the woman she had become. Her eyes, once bright with dreams, now carried shadows of sleepless nights. Faint lines etched her face, carved by tears and silent endurance. Yet beneath the scars of suffering, there flickered something else, something fierce, something unbroken. For the first time in years, she did not look away. She studied her reflection with a mixture of sorrow and pride. She was not the girl who had once believed love would heal all wounds. She was a mother now, a protector, a woman who had survived battles no one else had seen. The crack in the mirror did not weaken her. It reminded her that even broken things could still reflect light. In that stillness, a decision settled in her heart like a seed finally finding soil. She could no longer live as his prisoner, chained to his betrayals and drowned by his drunken laughter. She would not let Ayanda inherit a legacy of pain. Her voice was steady as she whispered to her own reflection, "Enough." And with that word, something shifted inside her. The silence of the night no longer felt suffocating. It felt like the beginning of freedom. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but she also knew she was ready to walk it. Word count, 365. The sun rose over Soweto with a warmth that touched the rooftops, but inside Lindiwe's home, the air was sharp with decision. Thabo stumbled from the bedroom, his swagger forced, his arrogance worn like a mask to hide the emptiness beneath. He stretched, acting as though the house was still his kingdom, as though the night before had left no scar. He dropped into the chair at the table, expecting breakfast, expecting obedience, expecting life to go on as it always had. But Lindiwe was no longer the woman who bent under his weight. She moved with calm precision, her hands gathering his clothes one by one, folding some, tossing others without care. The thud of each item hitting the doorstep echoed like a drumbeat of change. Thabo frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice carrying the tone of a man used to being obeyed. Lindiwe did not tremble. She stood tall, her back straight, her eyes unflinching as they met his. For the first time, she looked at him not as a husband, but as a stranger who had overstayed his welcome. Her voice was steady, her words carved with truth. "Leave. My children will not inherit this curse." The sentence cut deeper than any shout could. Thabo's bravado faltered, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for power he no longer held. He tried to laugh it off, to dismiss her strength as temporary anger, but the steel in her eyes silenced him. Outside, the neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers rising as the sight unfolded. A man's clothes strewn in the morning sun, his pride spilling into the dust. Ayanda clung to her mother's skirt, sensing the gravity of the moment. Lindiwe placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, her gesture declaring that from this day forward, their lives would be different. Thabo, stripped of control, stood frozen, the door no longer his passage to authority, but his exit into exile. And as he finally stumbled outside, the house behind him no longer belonged to his tyranny. It belonged to her courage. Word count, 365. The streets became Thabo's new home, a place where the cold pavement replaced the warmth of a bed and the laughter of strangers replaced the love of family. Once he had been a man others admired, his friends envied his charm, his neighbors respected his stature, and his wife and daughter looked up to him with hope. But now he drifted from tavern to tavern, searching for comfort at the bottom of cheap bottles, comfort that never lasted beyond the final sip. He sat slumped against walls painted with graffiti, his clothes wrinkled, his shoes worn thin. People who once greeted him with respect now passed by with pity, some shaking their heads, others turning away in silence. He felt the sting of their eyes, the unspoken reminder that he had fallen from grace. In the dim corners of taverns, he was just another shadow, begging for one more drink, one more escape. At night, when the streets grew quiet, the weight of loneliness pressed hardest. He would stare into broken glass bottles, seeing his reflection distorted and strange. The man staring back at him was hollow-eyed, with cheeks sunken and spirit broken. He remembered the days he walked into his home with pride, Ayanda running to him with open arms. Now the only arms that embraced him were the cruel grips of despair and addiction. Every drink deepened the emptiness. Every step into another alley was a step further from the man he once was. His laughter, once full of life, had become a bitter echo that mocked him in the silence. He thought of Lindiwe, her strength, her unshaken resolve, and he felt shame burn deeper than the liquor in his throat. Thabo's fall was not sudden. It was a slow unraveling, a steady collapse built on his own choices. And as he sat beneath the dim glow of streetlights, he realized the cruel truth. He had traded the love of a family for the loneliness of the streets, and the reflection staring back at him from the bottom of every bottle was nothing but a ghost. The house that once echoed with arguments now filled with the soft hum of a sewing machine. Lindiwe sat by the window, her hands steady as they guided fabric beneath the needle. With only a second-hand machine and scraps of cloth, she began to build something new. Neighbors brought torn dresses, school uniforms, and shirts needing repair, and she welcomed each piece with care. Every stitch was more than work, it was healing, a way of turning her brokenness into purpose. At first, the money was small, just enough for bread and soap. But Lindiwe carried herself with dignity, greeting customers with warmth, delivering clothes neatly pressed and smelling fresh. Soon, word spread through the township that her hands could breathe new life into old garments. Mothers brought their children's uniforms, young women asked for dresses, and even men arrived with trousers in need of mending. Slowly, the coins she earned began to fill a small jar on her shelf, a jar that symbolized hope. Ayanda often sat nearby, watching her mother's every move. She saw the determination in Lindiwe's eyes, the patience in her hands, and the quiet strength in her spirit. Sometimes she would hand her mother pins or thread, proud to play even the smallest part. To Ayanda, her mother was no longer just mama. She was a phoenix, rising from ashes with wings stitched by resilience. Lindiwe's days were long, but her heart was light. For the first time in years, she smiled without forcing it. The mirror that once showed her scars now reflected a woman of courage, a woman who had refused to be defeated. Each night, she whispered prayers of gratitude, not for riches, but for the chance to stand again. Her pain had not disappeared, but it had transformed. The sorrow that once chained her had become fuel for her strength. And as she folded the clothes neatly into baskets for her neighbors, she knew she was sewing more than fabric. She was stitching together a future of dignity, strength, and hope for herself and her daughter. The marketplace buzzed with life, vendors calling out prices, children weaving through stalls, the scent of roasted corn and spices drifting in the air. Thabo wandered aimlessly, his clothes ragged, his pockets nearly empty. He had come in search of cheap food, but instead, he stumbled upon a sight that pierced him deeper than hunger ever could. There, at the center of the market, stood Lindiwe. She was surrounded by neatly displayed dresses, skirts, and school uniforms, each piece stitched with care. Her head was held high, her smile warm as she greeted customers who spoke to her with respect. Coins clinked into her jar, fabrics exchanged hands, and laughter floated from her stall. She looked radiant, not because of riches, but because of the dignity she carried like a crown. Thabo froze in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He had once been the man who walked beside her, the man who had her love, her loyalty, her trust. But now he stood outside her circle, a shadow watching the light he had thrown away. Shame rose in his chest, heavy and suffocating, pressing down harder than any drink ever had. As he watched her, memories clawed at him, nights of mocking her cooking, mornings of stumbling home with another woman's perfume clinging to his shirt, afternoons when her silence screamed louder than words. He remembered the day she threw him out, her voice steady, her eyes unflinching. He had laughed then, convinced she would break, but she hadn't. Instead, she had risen. Now he saw her not as the woman who endured his cruelty, but as the woman who built her own strength. The crowd respected her. Her daughter stood proudly by her side, and Thabo felt smaller than he had ever felt before. For the first time, he realized the truth. The greatest wealth he had ever possessed was not money, not pride, not the admiration of friends. It was the woman he had lost, the woman who now stood before him, thriving without him. And in that bustling market, regret echoed louder than any noise around him. The night was still, the moonlight spilling softly over Soweto's quiet streets. Lindiwe sat inside, mending a dress by the dim glow of a lamp, when a knock came at the door, slow, hesitant, almost fearful. Her hands froze, the needle slipping from her fingers. She knew that knock. It was not the confident pounding of a man who once claimed the house as his own. It was the trembling plea of someone who had lost everything. When she opened the door, there stood Thabo. His shoulders were slumped, his clothes torn, his eyes hollow yet desperate. The swagger that once defined him had vanished, replaced by a broken man who barely looked like the husband she once knew. His voice cracked as he spoke. Lindiwe, please, I have nothing. I was a fool. Give me one more chance. Tears gathered in his eyes as he sank to his knees on the doorstep, his hands clasped together like a beggar at church. He poured out promises of change, of sobriety, of becoming the husband and father he should have been. His words tumbled into the night, desperate to rebuild a bridge he himself had burned. Behind Lindiwe, little Ayanda peeked out, her tiny hands clutching her mother's dress. Her wide eyes were filled with questions too big for her young heart. Should she hope? Should she fear? She remembered the shouting, the slamming doors, the tears on her mother's face. Yet here was her father, no longer loud and proud, but small and broken. Lindiwe's heart was heavy. She did not speak, but her silence carried more weight than any reply. She looked at him, this man who had once been her dream, then her torment, now her supplicant. The quiet stretched between them, pressing against the night air. Thabo sobbed, pressing his forehead against the cold ground. But Lindiwe stood unmoved, her hand resting on her daughter's head, her silence an answer in itself. For in that moment, forgiveness was not about words. It was about deeds yet to be proven. Word count, 365. The night air was cold, carrying the weight of a decision that could not be delayed. Thabo knelt at the doorstep, his tears soaking the dust, his voice hoarse from begging. But inside the doorway stood Lindiwe, tall and steady, her children gathered close beside her. Ayanda clung tightly to her dress, her little brother rubbing his eyes, woken by the commotion. The home that once trembled under his rage now stood guarded by her silence and her strength. Thabo raised his head, his face streaked with sorrow. Please, Lindiwe, I am not the same man anymore. I will change. I will be better. I promise you. His words spilled out like water from a cracked vessel, desperate to fill the emptiness he had created. For a long moment, she only looked at him, her eyes unreadable. She had heard promises before, empty, repeated, wasted. But now she was no longer the woman who waited to be saved. She was the woman who had already saved herself. Her voice, calm yet firm, cut through the night. Redemption is not in words, but in deeds. The sentence fell between them like a stone in water, rippling through the silence. Thabo's lips trembled, but he had no reply. He knew the truth of her words, knew that his promises were nothing without action. The children shifted closer to their mother, sensing the power of her resolve. Lindiwe did not say yes. She did not say no. She simply stood, her body blocking the doorway, her presence declaring that this home was no longer a prison of pain, but a sanctuary of healing. Whether Thabo would ever step inside again was a question left to the future, a choice tied not to his pleas but to his proof. As the moonlight spilled across her face, Lindiwe pulled her children close. She was no longer defined by betrayal, no longer chained to sorrow. She had risen from ashes into light. And in that moment, the greatest love story was not about a husband and wife. It was about a woman who chose herself, her children, and her strength.